Hello and welcome to the Gaggle Challenge, and if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely. With me today, of course, is co-founder of the Gaggle, Peter Lavelle, and we have a special guest today, the Tarik Cyril Amar, who is, of course, a frequent guest on Crosstalk. He appears regularly on RT, and of course, he's an expert on Germany and German politics, which we want to discuss today. But before we get onto that, and then maybe segue into a little bit about Trump, Putin, Russia, Ukraine, latest developments, perhaps Tariq, you could tell us a little bit about yourself. How you ended up where you're working currently in Turkey, and how you came to work at RT and become a kind of a regular in this alt media universe.
Yeah, of course. First of all, let me thank you for having me, both of you. Very kind. Concerning myself, I'm a historian by training. I went to Britain and then to the United States. I got my undergraduate degrees and my master's in Britain, actually at Oxford and the LSE, and then I went to Princeton and wrote a doctoral thesis. Um, uh, I'm very much, as a historian, I have always very much been concerned with very recent history. So really the 20th century to an extent, the 90s, but mostly the 19th to an extent, but mostly the 20s. And over time, for various reasons, I think mostly, if I can summarize, because the world was getting worse and worse and worse, I was getting more and more interested in, for want of better words, current affairs,
So
politics,
were you born in
geopolitics.
Germany? Are you from
Oh,
Germany?
yes. Yeah, I should specify that exactly. I was born and raised really in Germany, to be precise, in West Germany. I went to school there. I'm such a West German. I even went to do service in the West German army at the very end of the tail end of the Cold War, I just call it. And then after that, I basically have lived outside Germany. Continuously because everything else has taken place outside my whole university education. I spent, maybe I should say this because it's relevant to some of the things that sometimes I write about or I talk about. I spent a total of 5 years of my life in Ukraine, actually. I have also been to Russia frequently, but for much shorter stays. So Ukraine is actually a country in which I have stayed and lived for a long time. Um,
Where in Ukraine did you live?
the sort of very Ukrainian part. I lived in Lviv, right, in the very west, where people are very proud of, as they think, representing the pure Ukrainianness that they sometimes think the other Ukrainians lack, which is a very problematic attitude.
Right.
But it's interesting in many ways. It's a beautiful city. And
Yeah, I mean, the Poles say it's a very beautiful Polish city. Yes,
yeah, they still say that.
they still
I
say that.
know.
They still say.
Lviv, I know. And I think some Ukrainians in Lviv are still paranoid about that, actually. That isn't entirely
I
gone.
would be too.
So, but there's another aspect of it which is interesting, which is now things are shifting, and they have been shifting for a while. I don't want to essentialize the situation in Ukraine, but a while ago, if you went to say what is now Dnipro and used to be Dnipropetrovsk, right, or even to Kiev, you would have a much higher possibility of speaking Russian in everyday life than Ukrainian. Now, at that point, at least, when I was there, Lviv was the only major city. There were smaller ones, but it was the only major city that everyday life was really Ukrainophone. So that side effect of that for me was that I had known Russian before, but I really had to learn Ukrainian, apart from the fact that I had to learn it for my
We,
research,
we
right?
should we should point out. I mean, up until 2014, after 2014, I'm persona non grata there. But from 2005 to 2000, let's just 14, before the coup, went very regularly to Kiev. I like Kiev a lot, and the only language that you heard around you was Russian. Okay, I can remember
Yeah.
one of my colleagues with me we were on the underground, and they had, the next stop is or whatever they say. And my friend, she said, "What language is that?" And I said, "That's Ukrainian." Okay, because everywhere else was just Russian. Or if you said another way, if you spoke Russian, nobody batted an eye. Okay,
no, not at all. In fact, I knew somebody who ran an archival reading room, very intelligent, very interesting elderly lady. And her habit was to figure out which language as a foreigner you spoke best, Russian or Ukrainian. And then she would fluently address you in the other one. She always did that. But anyhow, so yeah, so I actually have intense experience with as it were, a very Ukrainian part of Ukraine, or a part that at least considers itself very Ukrainian. I also wrote my first book about that city. 2 of these 5 years I spent there doing research, and then later another 3 years I went back and I actually ran an institute, a center that was studying urban history in Lviv and also beyond Lviv, obviously. And then I spent 8 years, I think, at Columbia University, where in the end I had to leave because they wouldn't give me tenure, which I still think was scandalous, but that's my opinion. And that's how I ended up, among other
George and I
things.
have our own academic. we don't need a crying towel here. Let's keep going.
Yeah, absolutely. So I went to Turkey after that, and I've been in Turkey for 6 years now, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
Well, Tarik, I mean, one of the interesting things here, one could, at face value, not a critique, but his observation, he had a pretty conventional path. I know the academic path. I know the grind, the hard work, the going into the archives, but I mean, you were born in Germany, and you speak German. You were even in the German military. I mean, how did you end up on, let's say, our path of thinking? I mean, what happened to you? Because everybody asks, what happened to you, Peter?
Well, look, I think really there are 2 reasons. Okay, one is I've already mentioned that I simply am extremely interested in current affairs. I can't think of a better word, in politics, geopolitics, and so on. And I like being vocal about it, right? So I have tried to do that on Twitter. I'm trying to do it in my own writings where I have opportunities to publish, where I publish myself. But of course, the thing about RT has always been that I have worked with some other editors, right? And I don't care if people believe this or not, but the only editing I know which has never interfered with what I want to write is at RT. I'm not making this up. I've never had editing anywhere else where it was so clear that what I want to say is what I want to say, and it's not the task of the editor to push me in this or that political direction. And that I found always extremely attractive. I should say, to be honest and fully transparent, that at the beginning of the whatever you call it, the escalation, the large-scale invasion in February 22, I did for a long time not write for RT because at that point I was very angry because I didn't think it was the right decision. I have partly rethought that. That's a different issue. And then I started writing again, I don't even know, maybe a year ago or so, I think. And part of the reason, even then, although it was very, very early days, was that I wanted a platform again, partly to talk about Gaza, actually. And I was very aware that there was almost no way, there are some, but it's very, very difficult in Western media to talk straight about Gaza and Palestine and so on.
Mm-hmm. All right. Do you have any more questions, Peter, about?
I think for me, it just all 3 of us have. We have common interests, but the 3 of us have different trajectories, and it's really I've always find it kind of interesting how we end up in the going in the same direction. And one of the things that George and I try to do here, I think we have success. I mean, even though and with your being your frequent appearances on my program, we think in very similar ways, but then we are also very, very nuanced. And this is one of the things I like to do, bringing people on this podcast, is that we see the conflict in Ukraine and the conflict in Gaza very, very differently than most people that opine about it. But even among us, we can have very strong differences. And I think that's one of the services that George and I have been trying to provide, because I don't know how many thousands of hours of George we've really chalked up, but we've had some pretty heated debates. Okay, very heated. But I think it's cathartic. I think of things to bolster my argument, I have to think more seriously instead of just a knee jerk. Because when you watch CNN or MSNBC or Fox, they're just platitudes, and you end up thinking in platitudes yourself as binaries, and it shouldn't be that way.
Can I maybe add one third point? I'm sorry, but now it finally also came to my mind.
This is what happens.
Let me add a third point regarding RT, because usually I just say why I do it, but I sometimes feel, not with you guys, but with others, when they ask this question, that what they're really asking is, why do you not avoid doing that? How can you, right, work with the Russians and RT and so on? So when that is the question, when that is the real question I'm asking, I don't think that's the question you are asking me, but in those cases, I have to say, the more of that I get, the more I will actually work with RT. That's why I'm getting stubborn, because I really am absolutely convinced that Western mainstream media, CNN, Der Spiegel, BBC, you name it, Le Monde, everything I sort of have an eye on regularly, is at least as biased as RT, right? I'm not idealizing anybody. I don't think they're perfect media organizations. I don't believe in that. But Western media are a hell of a propagandistic lot. And if you look at the footprint of the West in the post-Cold War period and what Western media have been doing, right? To put it very bluntly, I really won't take any shit from people. That's absolutely impossible, right?
Yeah, and I think in some ways it's even worse with the mainstream media, because if you look at the RT's reporting, it's pretty down the line. I mean, it's pretty factual. There isn't the editorializing that now is de rigueur in pretty much all Western mainstream media, which is reporting. Now, we're not talking about the editorial pages, but the editorializing that goes on in the news reporting. Like, Putin's disinformation campaign, that's put in a news report. Putin's claims have been debunked.
And Western TV is even
the
worse.
far right. The far right.
The far right.
The far right pounces.
Says.
The far right always pounces. Okay.
The pounces, yeah. And then this is falsely claimed. And then and again, the sort of Russia's disinformation campaign, Russia's sabotage campaign against the West. These are in news reports. They never, it's like, you want to put, that it used to be the case. You had the editorial pages, right? People put their opinions in, but now this is just crept in throughout the Western mainstream media.
I totally agree. And I could give you examples from German mainstream TV news, which are still extremely powerful, even in the age of the internet. This is where a lot of Germans get their stuff. And when you look at, for instance, what they do on Gaza, they're replicating Israeli talking points and basically Israeli memos, word by word. That's all that is left. And some people see this and protest against it on Twitter, but that's about it. I mean, I agree with you, the bluntness with which Western media now operate. Maybe I'm nostalgic, right? So I have a certain age as well. I remember the 80s consciously and so on. Maybe I'm nostalgic. But I feel Western mainstream media have become worse, that they are more streamlined and more brutal, actually.
Well, I mean, the recent events in Amsterdam, how quickly the Dutch government just
insane.
The talking points from Tel Aviv. It was really astounding. Also, I think you both saw that Sky News report, an original report, and then they edited it, and it was radically different in what their presentation was. The first draft was pretty good, pretty much on the mark. Okay, but somebody didn't like that, and You'd think in the age of the internet, people would notice, and they do. When
They
you
do, but then who hears about that, right? I mean, I have to tell you, now that you mentioned the Sky report from Amsterdam during these Maccabi hooligan riots, right? Um, but when I saw that, I had to think of a very old movie by Verhoeven, I think from the 90s, which was called Running Man. And I don't know if you remember that
I
movie.
think
It
I
was
may have
Schwarzenegger,
seen it. Yeah. Okay.
right?
Yeah.
And it's all turning on the fact that a piece of news clip has been altered radically, right? But it's exactly the same thing. But in the movie, it's a dystopian story about a terrible future.
Yeah, I mean that's why. Okay, so the Onion bought Alex Jones. I mean, just think about that. Okay,
Have
I
they
mean,
done it?
But there
well,
hasn't been.
it's in
Yeah.
the works
It's
apparently.
in the works, but Alex
Yeah.
Jones still he lives to another day. I mean, he still hasn't gone through. So there's going to be another court hearing. But yeah,
Uh,
but anyway, oh, Germany. You follow events in Germany very closely, and our friend Sergeant Schulz, the German Chancellor, his coalition has collapsed.
My coinage.
Exactly, it was Peter's coinage. I mean, I think you initially, I think you said it as a kind of a mistake, and then you kind of
I don't.
it became, yeah, we always refer to him as Sergeant Schultz. But anyway, it was this traffic light coalition was always a very odd kind of a
yeah.
grouping where you had this the sort of the big spending Social Democrats and Greens with this fiscal austerity, Free Democrats. Anyway, it's now collapsed. There's going to be an election early next year,
Yeah.
and obviously now we have to wonder first of all how you think the election is going to go, which what the results are going to be, but also what happens after that. What kind of a coalition government is likely to emerge after the election?
Yeah, look, right now, when you look at the polls, these elections are now scheduled, I think, for the 23rd of February. Scholz wanted them even later, right? As somebody pointed out, I think in the British media, in Germany, that's what they call a snap election, right? It takes 3 months. But anyhow, so now we have them scheduled for the 23rd of February. The polls now show that the mainstream conservatives, the so-called Christian Democrats, the CDU and the CSU, together, that they will take over 30%, 32, 33, that sort of thing. They show the SPD, Scholz party, the so-called Social Democrats, taking about half of that, not more, half, 16, 15, whatever, right? And then you get into the more complicated cases, like what's going to happen to these liberals, the FDP, the other part of the Ampel, what's happening to the Greens, apparently sort of 11% right now, what's going to happen to Sarah Wagenknecht and her sort of new left-wing party, roughly speaking. Now, if you go by what the polls are showing you now, definitely the conservatives are going to win. That seems to be clear as of now. Then the question is, how are they going to build a coalition? Now, hypothetically, the figures that we see now might just about allow them to build a coalition with the AfD and get a majority in parliament that way. Might just about, right?
But that's not going to happen, surely.
That is very unlikely to happen because it does seem that the conservatives and especially the leader, Friedrich Merz, their chancellor candidate, they have really been fairly clear that they will exclude that. And I don't see how they can walk that back, right? Sooner or later, maybe in one election further down the road or two elections, I think they will normalize the AfD and it will become available for elections or coalitions. But I don't think it's going to happen this time yet. So if that doesn't happen, then they have to build some sort of coalition across the center, right? So one model is they can go together with Scholz and his people, the Social Democrats, so that they'll give us another grand coalition, great coalition, which is basically what Germany had before this whole Ampel thing started and what they had for a very long time under Merkel, right? That was the Merkel model. Or maybe if even that is not enough, they would have to add somebody, and it's where it gets complicated again. Now, let me add one more thing. I think we will probably talk more about this, so I don't want to sort of give a whole long lecture and not let you ask questions. But one unknown is, and it's a big one, that Scholz personally is so terribly unpopular, and everybody knows this. And I mean, today or yesterday, Spiegel actually had a headline saying that there is a revolt inside the Social Democratic Party against him, right? It's a bit like a Biden-Kamala scenario, right? Scholz is the Biden, and they all know this is not good for them. But there are the usual arguments. Schroeder is actually on that side, at least officially, where he's come out and said, no, no, let's not have a debate. That weakens us, right? Let's unite behind him, essentially. But there are also very heavyweight social democrats already lining up on the other side, sometimes very outspoken, sometimes a little less, but clearly signaling, oh no, maybe we should change. And then the question is, who would replace him? And the role of Kamala in this German scenario would fall to Boris Pistorius. That would be it. I mean, there's no other contender. Boris Pistorius is, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think his dream, his real dream, is to become NATO General Secretary. That's how I would describe him. He's a NATO ultra. He just loves NATO. He loves the Bundeswehr, the German military, and he's incredibly committed to this whole new politics of the so-called Zeitenwende, right? The change of epochs, or whatever you want to translate it as, which means that Germany is supposed to remilitarize, and remilitarize very much against Russia again, right? We are returning to that iteration of Germany where we think it's a good idea to face off against
I guess the
Russians.
third time's a charm, huh? Okay.
Yeah, right. So if Pistorius replaces Scholz, and the last moment that could happen, I think, is in early January, 11th January, as an official Congress of the Social Democrats, of Scholz and Pistorius' party. That is the last moment, as far as I understand, when Pistorius could be shoehorned in instead of Scholz if the revolt goes ahead. Pistorius, unfortunately, is personally extremely popular. He's actually the most popular politician in Germany. Very clearly, he's ahead of Merz, he's far ahead of Scholz,
Why?
and so on and so on.
Why?
Uh, that beats me because I don't find him interesting at all. But it seems that he has managed to project an image of a certain solidity that often appeals in German electoral politics. He also has projected an image of a certain straightforwardness. He's like a plain speaker. And people somehow have created this idea of him as this extremely steady, calm hand that would provide them with, I think there's a bit of looking for an Uber-father once again, with that sort of thing. He could be a male Merkel, right? Merkel was basically an Uber-mama to the Germans. I mean, it was very clear. And later they hated her. It got very sort of Oedipal, if that is the word, and they stuck the knife in once she was out. But I think in Pistorius, I don't want to psychologize so much, but I do think what counts a lot with him is this image of being this extremely patriarchal, heavy, gruff figure. Because you can't see much else. He's not a successful minister. What he's doing in his department, the Ministry of Defense, is, neither here nor there at best. It's not that he's sticking out as this shiningly successful member of the cabinet. That is definitely not.
Yeah, but Tariq, I mean, can you explain to me? I mean, we all know we were born in the post-war era. We are children of the Cold War. When you say, remilitarize and that you want an Uber father, I mean, what happened to the pacifism? What happened to the postmodernism? Germany's a pretty woke place. I mean, what's going on here? I mean, he seems antithetical to the tradition that Germany wanted to think of itself. If it's real or not, we can debate that, but the way they wanted to present themselves. So what accounts for this? The economic failure of the German model after joining the EU and the euro? I mean, is this a compensation for that?
I mean, I would say yes, except I think it's ultimately something else. it is true that Germany has been in essentially economic stagnation now for at least 6 years, depending on how you count, right? They now have officially a recession. It goes a little up, a little down. But actually, the stagnation effect is much longer. And when you read German economists, they are still very clear about the fact that they call this a deep structural crisis. And they contradict the German Minister of the Economy. We have to talk about him too, right? Robert Habeck, who's constantly feeding the public with these completely unrealistic assessments of the German economy and its near-term future. German economists, you know, to their credit, many of them don't go along with this and are still more realistic. But that's that's there. But frankly, I think what we are seeing now, this type of a new militarism, I do think it's a new militarism emerging, isn't coming from there. I think its root is something stranger, which is there is a famous study of German history by a major German historian called Winkler, and it's called The Long Road to the West, Der lange Weg nach Westen. So it's a very Whiggish story, right? So Winkler explains to you how the Germans, through all their crises, at least from, you know, Bismarck's Reich onward, they were always sort of in the middle and they didn't know where they belonged politically and culturally and so on. That gave them all sorts of trouble. And they gave all sorts of trouble to everybody else because of it. And then after 1945, the West Germans, at least, were successfully westernized, right? That's his story. And then, of course, when you get German reunification, the former East Germany is sort of just wrapped up in that package of westernization. And for him, this is a glorious story. He loves it, right? It's a big story of Germany's becoming a Western normal country.
Yeah, but it sounds kind of like a fairy tale to me, but anyway.
Absolutely, of course, but it's extremely authoritative.
But that's what people sometimes want.
I mean,
a MAGA is part of a fairy tale.
But that's in a way the interesting thing, because yes, there's the Westerners, but you know, I remember the 1970s and 80s in Germany,
yes,
and that became, you know, people were talking about the Drang nach Osten. It was a very different Germany. You know, you couldn't say anything negative at that time about East Germany, about the German Democratic Republic. I mean, I remember when I was studying at the Goethe Institute trying to learn German, they absolutely would never say anything at all negative about the DDR. And so, you know, so in a way, it's a kind of a more complicated picture that it's by no means is the
no. It was complicated. But here's the part that I wanted to sort of conclude with, which is that concerning Peter's question, where is this militarism coming from now? I think it's a conclusion of this process. Perversely enough, Germany now, the whole of Germany, has been a sort of overachieving member of the West in the worst way possible. And so it fully participates in what you could call this sort of Snyderian, liberal, Applebaum shift, you know, towards a new Cold War. And I know it's a stereotype, I'm one myself, but there is this thing about German culture that, first of all, they're not necessarily always fast, but once they really catch on to something, they tend to go overboard. And so now the Germans have become, to me, they are the Über-Westerners, like the Über-NATO pupils. This is what has emerged.
Well, you get that with the Greens.
Yes, the Greens are the perfect expression of it, and the trajectory fits this very well.
It's monstrous.
But George is right. This wasn't preordained. He's absolutely right. The 70s, even into the 80s, were different. Absolutely. Partly, I remember this myself, and of course, it's also a historical fact. But the interesting thing about this, George, is that other trajectory, you know, Ostpolitik and so on, is now demonized. You couldn't believe how much that is now being demonized in Germany and how much it has become a mainstream thing to disparage that and to make very cruel fun of it, right? It's now very fashionable to actually mock the fact that anybody would even consider trying to talk to the Russians instead of just confront them. But you're right, it used to be there, George.
But is that manufactured consent from above?
To an extent it is. But how do you manufacture? I mean, that gets you to very I mean, to a more general question, right? Can you manufacture consent if there's not something coming from below either? Apparently, there is a demand for this. Watch German talk shows. I know talk shows are part of the manufacturing consent machine, and you always see the same 5 people essentially talking about Russia. It's insane, right? So when you go on social media, on Twitter and so on, you see other people. You see that there are Germans who see this differently. And that's a little bit split east and west. You get more people who want a different policy towards Russia in the former East Germany. But it's not that there's nobody in the West. But if you look at these sort of commanding media heights, what sort of shapes the public sphere still, that is very much on this monotone, pro-NATO, almost fanatical track right now. I'm not saying it's irreversible, but now it's bad.
Is there any discussion about German sovereignty? What does German sovereignty mean in this paradigm?
German sovereignty, here's the problem. Germany doesn't have a gaullism. It doesn't. And what I mean by that is, at least when de Gaulle came back, right, at the end of the 50s, he was a mainstream political force. He was a very peculiar political force in France, right? But he dominated the environment until the end of the 60s, and he brought in his extremely strong sovereignist thought, which he had developed long before, as we know. That doesn't exist in Germany. The problem is that sovereignist thought has been marginalized to radical parties. It is not something the mainstream parties do, right? That is the issue. The mainstream parties, the SPD, the CDU, so the Social Democrats, the Conservatives, the Greens, of course the mainstream party, the FDP, they're all thoroughly Atlanticist. And in this case, I would use Atlanticist as the synthetic opposite of sovereignist. They're absolutely not sovereignist. Their discourse is rather to treat too much insistence on sovereignty, as they see it, as already a sign of radicalism or a bad sort of nationalism. Right? I think that in the future there might be a break-in into the center of the political system, and it's not yet happening, of the sovereigntist idea. It's not there yet. It's not reflected anywhere. If you look at Friedrich Merz, for instance, right, who wants to be chancellor for the Conservatives, and he may very well get to be that. I mean, on Russia, he's absolutely not better than Scholz. If anything, if he doesn't change, he's even worse, and he's not better on NATO. So, right now,
I mean, for instance, when it comes to this Taurus missiles, Scholz is still holding to this position that no Taurus missiles for Russia. And I was going to ask you, do you think he's going to stick to that position? But Merz has criticized Scholz. Oh, no, give him the Taurus missiles. So, so if there is going to be this CDU-led coalition, it's going to be much more hawkish than Sergeant Schulz's coalition.
At least if we consider what they're saying now, right? I mean, who knows what they'll do in the end? But measured by what they're saying now, what they're telling us, you're absolutely right. Merz has, I'm paraphrasing, but he has essentially said very clearly, if I get to be chancellor, I will set an ultimatum for Russia, and if they don't obey, essentially, always a good idea, then I will give the Ukrainians the Taurus missiles to do whatever they want with them. That's Merz's official position. Is Scholz going to finally topple over on this flip-flop? I don't think so, but it's a guess. Scholz has flip-flopped on many other things before. Moreover, imagine a situation in which Scholz is no longer the candidate even. If the revolt goes through inside the Social Democratic Party, Pistorius, the current defense minister, becomes chancellor candidate. He probably still won't make chancellor, but he becomes a more powerful second in the emerging coalition. Then you have two hawks up there. You have Pistorius and Merz. So right now, if they go the path they're indicating, nothing points to things calming down or becoming more diplomatic or more oriented towards negotiations, and everything points towards more escalation and radicalization. Will this actually happen? I doubt it because I think the external circumstances will change so much that they can't get away with it. But that's another issue, of course.
Well, I mean, let's take a look at priorities here. I mean, we have talked about some of the um, uh, intricacies of how different parties look at foreign policy. It looks pretty unified. But is that the top of mind for voters? I mean, you just said
Yeah.
that the country is in recession. It's been essentially a slump for 6 years. I mean, where does that fit into the mix here? I mean,
Yeah.
because the way I look at it is that you look at external enemies or adversaries, real or imagined, because you don't want to talk about the deindustrialization of the country.
I think that I think you're right that foreign policy is not the priority issue, although I think it has importance, but the priority is the economy. The priority is the economy, and it's not only that people, feel the fact that Germany is doing very badly right now. That you can actually feel that in your everyday life. It's also the fact that many of them are very anxious. Germany is now in this trapped situation where you have a lot of people who are directly affected by the economic downturn already. And then you have people sort of above that economically who are still doing okay, but they're looking as it were downwards and they're thinking, tomorrow that's me. So the anxiety is much more widely spread than the direct effect, and the direct effect is already very considerable, right? So I do think the economy is extremely important. If you think about the way that the coalition, the Ampel, right, the traffic light coalition has collapsed, that was the trigger. It was the economy. They couldn't agree on how to kickstart, restart the economy. They couldn't get the budget for next year together. That was sort of an effect of that as well. And that's where it broke down. And one huge issue that crystallizes that, apart from the budget, is the famous debt brake, right? The Germans have this weird thing where they have essentially made it a constitutional provision, not just a law, it's a constitutional provision that the government's capacity to do deficit spending is incredibly restricted, right? They've bound their own hands. And so that's an ongoing debate. And interestingly enough, that doesn't cut necessarily the way you would think in party terms. Even Merz, the conservative leader, has signaled that he is open to some discussion of modifying the debt brake, which you would not usually. This is not the mainstream conservative position. The only party that is absolutely unforgiving on the debt brake are the liberals, the FDP, the party of the former finance minister Lindner, right? And they currently in the polls are under 4%. If that remains the case, they won't even be in parliament because, as you know, there's a barrier at 5%. You don't get 5%, you're not even represented. You don't get seats in the parliament in the end. So the debt brake is going to be an issue, one way or the other. The other thing that Germans are very concerned about, and it has to do with the economy, is the so-called Bürgergeld, citizens' money. I don't know how to translate it well, which is essentially a way in which a new name for what used to be called Hartz IV, it's not so important, which is something the state gives to people who are unemployed. And this has been polarizing because there is a whole discourse now, which partly actually goes into the left, about this somehow being unfair. And so that people can sort of, take advantage of it and so on and so on. I don't think that's actually the case. I think that's a very exaggerated discourse, but the discourse is there. The topic is definitely there. And when you look at what the conservatives are promising, they're promising to get rid of this thing actually entirely, which I don't think they can do, but that's the promise.
Well, when I was a student in Berlin in the early 90s, trying to learn German, um, considering the social welfare benefits, I thought this would be a great place to live. I mean,
And that's a long time ago.
it was a
That's
long time
important.
ago, but I mean,
Yeah.
I saw how people took advantage of it. I mean,
Yes.
you didn't even have to be all that clever. I mean,
No,
it
not
was
that.
always free food. One way or another, you were going to be fed. That's for
Yeah.
sure. Okay.
Yeah. I should say that that has been through two waves at least of major reforms by now, and those reforms have been made in essence neoliberal. So those sort of very bad years. I have been over for a while. But the issue is still there and is there again, right? You see interesting things like, for instance, look, Germany is doing economically very badly, but we know from pretty good research, it's hard to research, as you know, that the shadow economy is actually growing. The shadow economy is growing, right? So you have a clear sign that something is going on there, that people evade the taxes, they evade the rules, they evade the state, and they're actually economically active. Now, having a stagnant economy and a growing shadow economy is not usually associated with, a very good situation overall.
I lived through it in the 1990s here.
I know. So it's a very peculiar place. Migration is going to be a major issue, but similar, I mean, at a very abstract level. It's very different in detail, but similar to many other countries, including the USA. Migration is
I was going to ask about that because, the
Mm.
Alternative for Deutschland, I mean,
Yeah.
they're obviously they've been rising in the polls. According to the polls, they're in second place behind the Christian Democrats, and there are continual moves to try to get them outlawed. All these parliamentarians, these MPs in the Bundestag, they sign these motions to outlaw the AfD. So first of all, I want to find out, is there any chance of that happening? And second of all, how, they obviously will be run in this election. How do you think they're going to fare?
So whenever I say something or write something about the AfD, I have to say one thing about myself. I'm not trying to be vain, but I should say, as a matter of transparency, I'm a socialist of some sort, right? A culturally conservative socialist. That's where I'm coming from. And having said that, so I have no sympathy for them politically. I can't. But having said that, I've always been very much against banning them. I think that's an awful, horrible idea. And there are really two reasons for that. One is, if you look into the legal conditions for actually banning a party in Germany, fortunately, these conditions are very strict. You have to have an enormous amount of evidence, and that's as it should be. And the only way that you could possibly get this evidence, this is the irony, is by heavily subverting a party with basically spies. But that's not a joke, right? So
It's called entryism. Yes, right.
Not only entryism, you basically have to get the internal security services, and they have to start being highly active in these parties. It gets very complicated because before you can.
Oh,
it looks like it's frozen.
Okay, let's see if it gets unfrozen. Okay, well, George, you keep talking. I'm going to message him to go out and back in.
Exactly. Go out and come back in. No, I think that's absolutely very interesting. And we here at the Gaggle have covered this. Oh, okay, good. You're back.
We're back.
Right. Either you're not serious when you say that, right? Either you're not serious when you say that, or you want to bend the rules, when I hear the Greens say we want to ban the AfD, I think they want to bend the rules because that's the way the Greens are nowadays, right? They don't give anything. Yeah, exactly. But you have to get through the Constitutional Court in the end too. And so the legal chances of doing this are extremely low in the case of the AfD. It's really not, I can't see how it could be done. It also takes many years. So if you try to initiate that now, it would certainly not work for this election. Right. The opposite would happen. For this election, it would definitely boost that, right? Because it be the victims.
This is I was talking to a German scholar. I think she's a historian or a social scientist of one sort or another. And, we talked about, obviously in the German context, January 1933. Okay. And you need to ban these parties because it's January 1933. But I retorted and said, but if you do ban these parties, you will eventually get a January 1933. I mean, it's a very vicious thing here. That's why I think it is absurd to do it. Either you believe in democracy or you don't. Okay, it's a pretty simple proposition.
No. I mean, I know that argument too. It's a terrible argument. It's completely misguided. It's drawing exactly the wrong lessons. I mean, one thing about January 33 is, to an extent, the rise to power of the Nazi Party in the state, in the government, is a result of their electoral successes, right? Which were actually already receding a little bit at the time,
Yes.
Yep.
but to an extent that is decisive, and I think more decisive. The Nazis can establish themselves in government because the conservative elites bring them in. That's what actually happens. It's a small circle of people around Hindenburg and I think his son who actually engineer this and bring them in. And the idea is that they would then sort of not be capable of dealing with the situation and ruin themselves, or that they can be controlled. So the story that has been told in West German political culture and that is being told in German culture now, that the Nazis come in because of elections, is actually extremely incomplete.
Right.
Elections play some role, but mostly it is a massive elite failure that finally clinches this in January 1933.
But there was also, it helped that you had the Reichstag fire, and then they seized on the Reichstag fire.
And then that, and they go from there.
Outlawed, essentially kind of emergency legislation
They
and so
build
on.
from there, exactly.
Yeah,
They
yeah.
seize the opportunity, and then by 1934, by several steps, they become like this full-blown thing. But back to the situation today, the other reason why I would never agree to banning the AfD is that by now the AfD is very successful. It's, for instance, unfortunately, I think, more successful than the BSW of Sarah Wagenknecht. Those are both challenger parties coming in. The BSW looked fairly good for a while. Now they're not looking so good, according to the most recent polls. The AfD is stable and very successful already.
Why is that? Why isn't Sarah Wagenknecht's party?
Let me get back to that, but let me conclude one point. If the others try to ban the AfD now, everybody who's not an idiot in Germany will understand that they are doing it because they're destroying the competition. And that is an enormously dangerous way of discrediting democracy. They're basically going to use a rule that is made for absolute emergencies, and they're going to use it as a sort of, as we would say in the east of Europe, polite technology. This is going to be pure manipulation, and people will see it, and that will undermine democracy in Germany. So
Yeah,
back to the
they should call it the Moldovan variant. Okay.
Yeah, learn from Moldova. That would be a new one. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, if Tim Snyder goes to the German parliament and tells them they should learn from Moldova, I think they will. It's gonna work. The Greens, at least, they're gonna travel there and try to learn. But
Well,
look,
why is the AfD stabilized?
yeah. Well, again, you're asking me about a party where it's difficult for me because I don't have empathy, right? And empathy helps explain. So I have to look at this very much from the outside.
Well, if I can say, George, I'm not German. I'm not really taking sides. But what I do, I think that if you're going to talk the talk of democracy, then you have to walk it. Okay,
Yeah.
and it's the presentation of this party. I can't say within Germany, but I can say outside of Germany. I mean, George and I unfortunately have to quote this awful publication called Politico, okay, which they are just a nasty lot of people. But the way they characterize the party is just so. I mean, it is so dishonest.
Right.
Okay.
And this woman who is the leader.
Because the way I look at them is that, do I want them to win? That's neither here nor there.
Yeah.
But I like the critique of power. That's what I like.
Yeah.
Right, but I mean, just go. The woman who leads in the Bundestag.
Alice.
Yeah, that's right. She seems quite impressive. I mean, she talks very well. She's a very good speaker, and I think a very effective debater and so on. So I mean, she looks impressive. I mean, I can't think of anyone saying Britain in the United Kingdom a political leader who is as effective as she is.
It's been a while. Look. I would agree with you that she's clearly very intelligent, Alice Weidel, and she had an impressive career in consulting before she did this. And not that I love consulting, but still, And she's sort of sharp and aggressive in a way that is impressive with a politician. I personally think, and again, it might be my bias, that Wagenknecht is an even better orator, but that's not important. Merz, the leader of the Conservatives, actually, I mean, among other things, he's a BlackRock-based millionaire, right? And so doesn't have my sympathy either, but he is a smart guy. I can see that as well, absolutely. And he's eloquent and he has a temper, but I'd rather have a smart guy with a temper than, somebody like Scholz or somebody like Annalena Baerbock, who, I'm sorry, I don't know if her IQ reaches 100. I really very much doubt it. No, I'm serious. So here's the intelligence issue. I give you that. But if you zoom out, right, and I'm trying to think about what do people want from the AfD? One is the protest, as Peter mentioned, it's the critique. It's the critique. And the current German political system is wide open to a lot of legitimate critique, right? So it's the critique. But then, of course, again, it's the AfD is extremely aggressive on migration. And I'm saying aggressive in a neutral way, but they're politically aggressive, so to speak, in occupying this topic. I think that the fact that they're actually not anti-Russian helps them in Eastern Germany. I'm putting this very carefully. But interestingly enough, the AfD and the Wagenknecht people have in common that, roughly speaking, they're not anti-Russian. And they're the only ones right now who are not anti-Russian, right? That helps in the East, especially. And then there's one other thing, and there I wonder if people won't be very disappointed in the end. I think that people also expect the AfD to repair the economy. So, somehow get us out of this rut, as it were. And, perhaps they could actually do this. But what people don't understand is that if you look closely at the AfD, I would argue they're actually FDP in the in the way they think about the economy. They're very neoliberal, right? So if there are voters who go for the AfD because they think these guys are going to save us from stagnation, they might be right, but they might actually experience that saving in a very harsh way because it would be a neoliberal saving, right?
Well, that's how I looked at the Brexit party and Nigel Farage. I mean, he talked sovereignty, he talked trade and all that. But if you scratch not too very deep, it's very neoliberal in its approach. Okay, I mean, the more I did research on it, I was almost aghast, to be honest with you. Okay, but I mean, this is kind of like using cultural norms to agitate and attract people. But the economic policy, when you get down to it, it's in the case of Germany, that it would have to be something that would have to have very large consensus and a very well thought out plan because
but in a way, I mean,
very difficult to change an economy like that.
But in a way, I mean, the foreign policy and the economic issues are intertwined because the sanctions and, of course, the energy policy have all hit Germany very hard. So where the Sarah Wagenknecht party and the AfD take a very critical attitude to the foreign policy, that will also help. With improving the economy because it's going to end the sanctions and end the this boycott of Russian energy.
Yes, I can only agree.
Well, I mean, Tarik, just because I'm curious and the German electorate and political system much far better than I do. I mean, does anybody talk about the Nord Stream pipeline? I mean, is that allowed?
It's allowed, but only if you lie. It's allowed, but you have to lie. Look, it's interesting. No, literally, it's interesting you ask because
I'm going to steal that. I like that. Okay, thank you.
Just now, like 2 days ago or so, Spiegel, right, this major, like trend-setting magazine that used to be very good and is now crap. I'm sorry, I have to be blunt here. Had another long story about Nord Stream. And so I look at this and I think, man, are they finally going to talk a little bit more realistically about it? No. The whole story is once again this new version where it did happen, right? And it wasn't the Russians, they've accepted that. It was the Ukrainians and only the Ukrainians, right? That's the current lie. The current lie is they've admitted it wasn't the Russians. That took them more than a year to break through to that. And now they're insisting that we cannot look anywhere else beyond Ukraine. And then when you read the story carefully, you even find these phrasings that basically seem to say, don't seem to say, that say yeah, we have to acknowledge this is this group of Ukrainian saboteurs, blah, blah, blah. But if you consider the situation, act of war, international waters, maybe it's not even a crime. So it's a completely perverse reception of the thing.
But
We have
it's very
never,
interesting because yesterday there was this news about the undersea cables, this
yes,
communication cable sabotage. The
yeah,
Germans sabotage, and
yeah,
CNN was running this. Oh,
yeah.
Russia, Russia was probably behind this. And you think, well,
Hmm.
the Germany is getting an awful lot of big talk from Germany
Yeah,
about these under the
yeah,
water cables when they've kept their mouths shut for 2
yeah.
years about Nord
It's
Stream.
insane. It's insane. I mean, look, what this really is um, I actually believe the Ukrainians were involved. I don't believe for a moment they could do it alone. I think it was the Ukrainians plus the USA, the UK, something. The Poles, obviously. The Germans now admit that the Poles interfered with finding out who did it. They still don't admit that the Poles probably helped do it, right? So they're still completely hedging, right? So several so-called allies of Germany committed this act of war. It's an act of war in peacetime. It's also actually, as far as I understand, it's the biggest eco-terrorist attack in European history. I mean, world history gets a bit more complicated, but European history, hands down, biggest eco-terrorist attack ever, right? And the perverse reaction of the German government, which is the most affected Western government, right? If we leave Russia aside for a moment, the perverse reaction of the German government was to say, well, first of all, we don't want to know who did it. Secondly, we do know who did it, namely the Russians, who had absolutely no motive. That was absolutely clear from the beginning. Third, we also want to give sort of several dozen billion euros by now to one of the states that did it, which is the Ukrainians. And at the same time, we want to keep ruining our own economy for the state that must have either said yes or supported them, which is the USA. This whole thing is completely insane.
Yeah,
And it
but
hasn't yet,
it
there hasn't been a tipping point yet.
well, it's one thing to say maybe the Poles knew something about it and the Ukrainians, the poor Ukrainians and all that. I'm sorry, it doesn't make any sense to me at all. The logistical
No,
expertise that was
no,
necessary to
yeah,
do something of that magnitude. You
no,
don't do
I
it on a
know.
yacht with a blonde and a drunken motley crew. It doesn't make any sense at all. It's an insult to our
I
intelligence.
know, I know, but Peter, this you have to look at the Spiegel story. It's written to try to persuade people like you, which it won't work. It wouldn't persuade me. But this is exactly what this story is trying to do. It is written to explain to us how these sort of 12 Ukrainians actually could get this done. That's the whole meaning of the story. It's completely insane. This is what Spiegel is up to nowadays.
Well, I didn't finish my thought. Sure, you can lay blame on the Ukrainians, the Russian aggression. We have to, that may be an explanation. The Poles are always causing trouble for everybody all the time anyway. That's been their historical role, but they don't want the United States to be blamed. That's what it's all
Yes,
about.
of course.
That's what it's all about.
All right.
Of course, they have to be accepted. In fact, there is a sideline in this story where the CIA is even presented as warning the
That's right.
Ukrainians.
Yeah.
You see it, right? The
No, no, that's
CIA,
right. But that's an
well
old story. The
known,
New York
well,
Times also ran with that story
yeah,
that the CIA were the
exactly,
good
same
guys.
thing.
They
Yeah,
warned
yeah.
they warned
But
the
George,
Germans that this was coming.
we
So
know
to
that the
speak,
CIA is extremely reticent about stuff
they
like that,
were the
right?
good.
They never.
When have they ever been?
But
Their genetic code is never.
exactly. Yeah. But look, here's something else about Nord Stream, if I may add that, right? This is all absurd theater. But here's the other question, which is we should long have a debate in the German public sphere about repairing it, right? And this is the other question you have to ask, where's that debate? It would be perfectly normal that we would be talking about, first of all, actually using the one part of it that is still workable. As you probably know, there's one tiny part that could still work.
Right.
And
Well,
Putin
no,
has said, so,
one of the lines. It
yeah,
was
exactly.
never passed certification. It
Yes.
was ready to, turn the
Yes.
switch or roll the wheel,
Yes.
whatever. They were just waiting for certification.
Yes.
And it exists. I don't think it was
Yes.
ever filled up with gas either.
Yes. But Putin has said several times that, you want to actually switch this on, we can.
Yep.
We don't talk about this in Germany, and we also don't talk about repairing it. And if, whatever lies they want to tell themselves about who did this, at least you would expect a more reasonable discussion about the damage that this has done to the German economy. And this goes back to George's point about the connection between the foreign policy, the energy policy, and the economic policies. The damage that this has done, it's obvious that we should think about repairing it, but we are not. That's still taboo. It's done. We won't touch that anymore.
So just a couple of questions. I mean, you were going to say something about why the Sarah Wagenknecht's party is in decline. What's the reason for that?
That's one of those things where I can't really understand it, and I'm trying to read up about it. We have a very recent poll by a big institute called Forsa, usually fairly reliable, and they show a very severe decline for them in general in polling, and they also show a severe decline for her personally. And the question is, how did that happen? I could imagine that some of it has to do with the coalition negotiations that happened in several German states, Länder in the east, Thuringia, Brandenburg, and Saxony, right? In Saxony, it failed. In Thuringia, they got it more or less done. Not yet totally, but it seems to be on its way. And those caused splits inside the Wagenknecht party. There was actually some acrimonious stuff going on there. Because in essence, what this did is what always happens in coalition agreements, that there were then parts of the party that started saying we should be very flexible just to participate, and other parts that said, well, if you're too flexible, then we're losing our identity, and so on and so on. And that may have damaged them. Otherwise, it's very hard to say because, look, they haven't actually been in government in any state yet, and they have certainly not been in government at the federal level. With the Greens, it's very clear why they are falling. With the FDP, it's clear. With the SPD, it's clear, because all of these parties are part of the governing coalition and they've made a mess, right? And so people are punishing the incumbents. But the Wagenknecht party is a newcomer. It's the opposite of the incumbents. And why they're experiencing this dip now, I really don't know. And I hope it will change again, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
Where does Germany go from this? I mean, it's pretty gloomy right now. I mean,
yeah.
Is the next election, are people going there out of desperation, out of anger, out of hope? I mean, what's the next page for Germany? Because in our conversation here, there's, this is the book of the history book of Germany is thick, and we went back a few chapters, and I wonder, how do people approach politics? Can politics fix things?
Look, I mean, I obviously I don't know. I have one thought about this, which is that in some way, Germany needs to be very lucky. Something has to happen that they don't control, and that they might be able to make a small contribution to, but really they can't control it, which is the war in Ukraine has to end. If the war in Ukraine were to actually end, right, whether it's called an official peace or truce or freeze or no, but if it actually ends, then maybe a door would open for a German government, either quietly or a little bit more explicitly, to revise this enormous misdirection, I think, that they've taken into this very harsh course against Russia, into this massive dependency now on the USA in terms of energy and economically in general. And they might be able to revise this idea of a very costly remilitarization. And look, I should be clear here, to an extent, to a very limited extent, I can understand the people in Germany who say, the German army needs to be modernized. It's actually objectively true because they've neglected it so horribly for so long, right? So either you have an army that actually counts, or you might as well just abolish the whole thing. But to have an army that is just sort of a heap of stuff that doesn't work, that's not very efficient. Okay, I get the modernization argument, but they're not talking about modernization. They're talking about massive expansion at very high cost. That's a very different game, right? That they want to engage in. And when you look at all the things they want to do, Merz, for instance, again, conservatives, likely to win the election. If they dominate the next government, Merz is promising people that he wants to decrease taxes for the middle classes and the corporations. And to be honest, I think he's right about this. I think he's right. Those taxes are too high in the German case. But so you decrease the taxes, you're still in a stagnation, right? You have the debt brake, and even if you modify the debt brake, it's not going to just be abolished, right? So you're not going to engage in massive deficit spending either way, and you afford yourself a massive military expansion. None of this makes sense, and they probably know this somewhere, right?
Well, Teddy, I mean, that's an intra-German discussion, but being a historian of modern European history, like the both of you are, German remilitarization is not a popular topic for the continent. I mean,
no.
And is it popular? Yeah, is it popular?
It shouldn't be.
Yeah,
I mean, you can have, people like Donald Trump and others saying, you have to pay your way, and you have the 2%, GDP, all this. But I mean, just given recent history, some people still remember it. Okay,
right. And is it even popular among Germans? I mean, do Germans really want to go for remilitarization? Because it's not quite what one thinks about Germans today.
What I can tell you is that there is a very intense effort to sell the idea to them. That if you follow German media, it's very clear. They're trying to sell the idea that the army is actually a good thing. They're not primitive. The German army, the Bundeswehr, has actually produced a graphic novel. You can find it somewhere on the internet. And in the graphic novel, a young boy, essentially from Berlin, right, a young man, decides to actually join the army, and we then follow him through basic training and so on. It's all very realistic. And all these topics of what happened in the past and what did my opa, my grandpa do for the wrong sort of army, they're all addressed. So it's very sneaky, what the graphic novel tells you is, oh, no, we are aware of that, but this is different. This is a new Germany with a new army. Please join it, and so on. And the ideological, the brainwashing, I would almost say, is very intense right now. How far they're going to get there, I don't know. But look at the prominence of German generals. I haven't seen this before. This is new. German generals and sometimes even colonels and so on now appear on TV in ways that they didn't. They haven't before. And they comment or they talk about this new so-called general operational plan, which has been turned into this huge media event. And the general operational plan, on one level, yes, it's a plan, but on the other level, it's clearly a public relations strategy. And it's aiming to get it into people's head that we really have to think specifically about a war against Russia, right? To the details, right? If the army moves east, who's going to mend the bridges and protect them from the saboteurs, right? And if all the truck drivers go to the army for the logistics, who is going to drive the trucks? And I mean, this stuff is now pumped into the public sphere, and people are supposed to really engage with this. You see, of course, similar tendencies in other NATO countries, right? You get this in Scandinavia, where they do little brochures like, what do you do when the Russians come? Keep your matches ready.
Maybe you shouldn't have joined NATO. You wouldn't have never needed to publish those.
Yeah, I mean, the Finns, what can we say, right?
Teddy, I know time is precious, but is this manufactured consent that with the U.S. pushing it? Because we're looking at the Trump's cabinet being developed, and obviously there's a very strong Zionist bent to these new appointments, but there are a lot of China hawks as well.
Yeah.
So So I addressed both of you here. So maybe are we reframing keep the Russians out, the Germans down, and the Americans in? Or is it now we keep the Russians out, the Germans up, and the Americans are going to have to focus their attention elsewhere? And Germany will be the surrogate. Sorry, Poland, it won't be you.
Yeah. Well, if I should look, unfortunately, I think the Poles won't be stopped so easily. They have engaged on an even more ambitious remilitarization program than the Germans. They are talking, they're not yet doing it, but they are talking about dedicating 4% of the GDP.
Right.
They have made these extremely ambitious contracts with South Korean arms manufacturers. So the Poles, I don't know what's going on there. But the
Well,
Germans,
then we have a militarized Germany and a militarized Poland.
yeah, right? That looks
What
good,
could
right?
go wrong?
Right next to each other. But look, but seriously, as I said, I think Germany would have a chance, an undeserved one maybe, the way they've recently been behaving, but they'd have a chance if the war ended, and they'd also perhaps have a chance if Trump gets serious and leaves the Europeans high and dry. Because they could go either of two ways. They could actually engage in what probably von der Leyen would love to do with all of the European part of NATO, which is, okay, if the Americans leave us alone, in essence, then we're going to build our own garrison state here, right? Or they could finally see, look, the war in Ukraine is over. The Americans are basically abandoning us. Maybe it's time to give diplomacy a chance again and actually learn to live with the Russians. Maybe,
I don't know.
I don't know.
See, I think it's
was
a very unlikely
yeah.
eventuality. It's just not the way the Americans think. But anyway, Tariq, I mean, this has been a really interesting discussion. Thank you so much for filling us in on latest developments in Germany. There's an election coming, so I hope you'll be able to join us before the election, and we can see.
Oh, I'd love to.
Give us an update on how things are going. So, Tariq, thank you very much. Peter, thank you. And remember, if you like the Gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.